Welcome to At Issue. I'm H. Wayne Wilson. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the 350th anniversary of an expedition by a Jesuit missionary and a French fur trader. And after 350 years, it might be time for a fresh look at the lasting effect the French had on what would become the state of Illinois and the adjoining states. And we'll have that conversation with Mark Wolzinski. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Mark is the author of Joliet and Marquette. It is a new history of the 1673 expedition that was 350 years ago. And we thank you so much for being here. Before we get started about the Marquette and Joliet, or Joliet and Marquette as you reference it in the title of the book, your background is with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources?
That's correct. I worked 25 years with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and then I taught college at Illinois Valley Community College for 9. But I've been studying history for decades, especially French Native American history of the Western Great Lakes, Illinois country, and such.
And with that, you have done what I would call exhaustive research in adding some, maybe at least to me, unknown aspects to the expedition of Marquette and Joliet. Before we get, and I want to talk about the trip, but what was the most surprising aspect of this before you started your adventure into this? What was the surprise? Or were there multiple surprises?
Yeah, I would say there were multiple surprises, or I would rather say multiple issues. Most of the books that were written that are most cited, most referenced, are from the 1960s, 1970s. Some as early as 1923, and some even from the articles and parts of books from the late 1800s. And I always had an issue with this point or that point. That just doesn't seem right. I don't know how these two are reconcilable. So
there was a different issue in one book versus another book, and you couldn't reconcile those?
There was that, but there was just, this didn't seem to make sense because the way the author may have spinned, and I don't mean spin, interpreted what he read. So there was enough of those where I said, all right, I am not the information police, but I have to look into this because there's some things that are extremely vague, some things are appear to be contradictory. So let's start off with a brand new, fresh look at this voyage. Instead of having those preconceived notions from the books and things that we have read, and a lot of these are really good books. But this gets more into the weeds, I guess I could say, about some of these issues.
So where does the 1673 expedition rank in American history?
Well, in my opinion, and I would say that it's every bit as significant as the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I would say, as far as humanity is concerned, the 1969 moonshot, going to places where no one has ever been before. Not no one, Native Americans obviously lived here for thousands upon thousands of years, but the French have never been there before. Man has, as far as we know, has never been to the moon. And so these are new ventures into places that were unknown to certain people.
Now we know that some notes were kept by one of them, and then there were very few notes by the other. Where did you find your information?
A lot of that information comes from the Jesuits themselves. We are so fortunate to be able to live today where we have access to some really good information. For example, one of my primary sources is called the Jesuit Relations, and that's a list of about 66, 67 different books that were published in France to reveal the exploits of these missionaries going into new places, the people that they met, the things that they saw. And you can get that online right now in fantastic translations by Reuben Gold Thwaites You can actually read the reports from great translations if you're not fluent in 17th century French, and they are outstanding sources of information from the people who were there, who wrote it down, what they saw.
And we know that the French, amongst the nations that were exploring the region, the British, the Spanish, etc., but the French were really good at keeping records.
They were the best. When you were born, France and Canada were essentially church states. Okay, both institutions fought for the favor of the king to be able to do this or to be able to do that. And they kept really, really good records, especially the church records, because when you were born, there would be a record of the day you were born, who your parents were, who your brothers were, where they lived, and such. A few days later, on your baptism, who your godparents were, where they lived, and information like that. We can take that all the way till when you get married. All that information is going to be recorded, and then we're going to go to your will. What you own, where it's at, who gets what, why they get it, and so on and so forth. So actually, we know more about an insignificant Frenchman who lives somewhere in southern Illinois along the Mississippi River than we know about some American heroes like Daniel Boone.
Let's talk about the trip. It started in May of 1673.
Correct.
In St. Ignace, which would that's an area that would become the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
Correct.
That's not the Mississippi River.
No.
So they go by land over to the Mississippi?
Well, what they did is they left. There was 7 Frenchmen, Joliet, Marquette, and 5 canoemen, and one of them was a man by the name of Jacques Largier, who figures big in Illinois history as being a linguist and scribe for other later Jesuits. And so they left St. Ignace, which is right by the Mackinac Bridge, if you're familiar with the Upper Peninsula, and they scooted down the shore of Lake Michigan, and they would stop at Indian villages, Native American settlements that they encountered. At the Menominee River, where they encountered the Menominee, where those people tried to convince Joliet and Marquette, don't go any further because there's monsters, sea monsters and things like that can get you. No, we're going. And so they reached the Fox River of Wisconsin, paddle up the Fox River of the Wisconsin to the Wisconsin Portage at today's Portage, Wisconsin. From there, they took the Wisconsin River all the way to the Mississippi. They landed there 30 days after leaving St. Ignace. From there, they went south, stopping at a couple of Indian villages. One of them was the reason for Marquette's coming to Illinois, and that's the Illinois Indian villages that run the Des Moines River. And so
that became the Missouri River.
No, this is the Des Moines River.
Oh, okay, all right. So before we go further on the trip, was one of the goals to find out where the Mississippi went?
Yes, if we look at Louis Joliet represented the state or the secular government. Jacques Marquette represented the church. And it was common at that time to have these well-educated Jesuits and other, for example, Sulpicians that went on La Salle's first expedition. Some of these people were military officers, cavalry officers, before they gave that up to join the priesthood. Some of these guys were really sharp. And so it had a representative of both the church and state in the same canoe as they went down. And one of Lewis's objectives was to find out whether or not the river that the Iroquois speakers call Ohio, is that the same river that the Algonquian-speaking tribes from Minnesota and Wisconsin call Mississippi? Are they the same river? Just two different names for the same river? Or are they the same river? And so that was one of Joliet's, one of his tasks to do. And since all rivers eventually dump into a sea, which sea does it dump into? Because all they had was speculation. Because of the way the Native Americans told the French Jesuits about where their villages are at by this great river, it may appear to them that maybe this river pops out in Virginia. Maybe it pops out in the Sea of California. Maybe it pops out at the Sea of the South, which is the Gulf of Mexico. So that's one of Joliet's primary missions, to find these things out.
So they're headed down the Mississippi, but they don't go all the way. It does obviously dump into the Gulf of Mexico,
Sure.
But they don't go that far.
Correct.
Why is that?
Well, they're getting into areas that were extremely unfamiliar to them. Most of the journey was unfamiliar to them, but they ended up at the Arkansas village at today's Arkansas River near its mouth with the Mississippi. And they could tell by speaking to the tribe. They couldn't speak the language. So now Marquette, who was the linguist of the party, he's out of his range. So we really can't speak to these people anymore. But they learned from a kid from another village that they met, that who acted as an interpreter for them, that there's some real problems down here. First of all, these tribes that are down there are very hostile. You're not going to go through their territory. It's their territory. Secondly, there's possibility that the Spanish are down there. And if the Spanish catch you, you're not going back home. And they could see just how truthful these tribesmen were to them, because they saw that their village had nothing. They didn't have any trade goods. All they had was just a few things that they could gather. A buffalo hide, for example, was considered a great luxury for these people, when farther up north there's buffalo hides everywhere. And so they realized that, all right, we know this river dumps into the sea. We believe them. We've stopped at other villages, and they said it dumps into the South Sea. We believe them. We see that these people are not lying to us. I think we better go back up north, because they had probably collected curios, specimens, birds, plants, who knows what. Marquette never mentioned any of those things, but if you're going to be on an exploratory expedition, you're going to take samples of these things to show, samples of ores that they may have found down the way.
So they go north on the Mississippi against the current.
Yes.
So now the trip's more difficult.
Much more difficult, because as Marquette noted, as they were going down the Mississippi River, once they passed the Missouri River, the Missouri River was flooded. There was whole trees and islands and everything that was being belched out into the Mississippi. And so that crew paddled in the hot summer sun in the Mississippi River Valley down there, which is always full of mosquitoes and always hot and humid, 440 miles to get to the Illinois River. And it took them 44 days.
Why did they decide to go up the Illinois? Because they had already come down the Mississippi, and they said, well, this is a new river?
Well, they stopped at actually two Illinois villages on the Des Moines River, which would be at today's Illini-Wek State Historical Site in Clark County, Missouri, right up in the far upper corner of Missouri. And one of the chiefs there gave him a boy to go with him. And that boy, we found out, was actually a guide, okay? Because there's rivers all over the place dumping into the Mississippian streams. Well, you have all these Illinois villages. You have two of them on the Des Moines River. You have one up by Starved Rock. You have Illinois living up on the Fox River in Wisconsin. You have them living in southern Illinois. You have them all over the place. They communicated with each other. This is nothing new. They knew when the feasts were being held, when the communal buffalo hunt is being held, when it was time to look for a mate. They knew all that stuff, so they had communication. So this boy has obviously been to Kaskaskia, which is the large Illinois Indian village right near Starved Rock. He had been there before. And if you look at what the Illinois River would have looked like in 1673, look at Emaquan or by Meredosia. It's nothing but huge backwaters, islands, false channels, isthmuses. There's lakes on islands. And later explorers, as late as the 1800s, says we got so twisted and turned around there that it took us a day to get out of it, to extract ourselves because we made a wrong turn. People like Henry Schoolcraft wrote things like that. So this boy got them up that new stream where no European that we know of had ever ascended, and took them to the Indian village there near Starved Rock.
And just for clarification, the Indian villages at Kaskaskia up by Starved Rock, don't confuse that with the first state capital.
Correct.
Two completely separate issues. As they come up the Illinois River, what do we know about their time here in the Peoria area, the Peoria Lake, et cetera? We know, we refer to it as Lake Pimatu'i. What do we know about that?
From Marquette's writings, and remember that his journal was actually his report, so he wrote great detail about villages in Wisconsin, about finding a certain kind of plant, about the villages there in northwestern Missouri. But from the time they left the Arkansas village to the time they landed at Green Bay, there's just a handful of sentences. For some reason, Marquette did not write very much, just the very important things. We're on this river, which they called the River St. Louis. We stopped at an Illinois village we call Kaskaskia. There's a portage there, and we got a couple of guides to take us the rest of the way. And that's about it. Now, yes, it's possible he ran out of ink. It's possible he ran out of paper, but they would use vellum at that time. Or it's possible, probable or likely, that he was very sick, because we know he spent the next year recuperating from a horrible illness that he got while on that journey. So he didn't really mention that much. Where we get the better information is from people that were right after Marquette. Henri Joutel, who came through here in his party in 1687, from LaSalle, who was here in January of 1680, and from other people. And so you can piece together, because these guys saw the same things as Marquette and Joliet. Marquette, who kept the notes, just for whatever reason did not document, didn't write it down. So what I do is I go back to these reports from later on, some of them shortly thereafter, to be able to make a good full view of their journey.
For instance, Lake Pimatu'i, roughly translated, at least what we assume is Fat Lake, and that's because there was plenty of wildlife around Peoria Lake, what became Peoria Lake. Is that, I mean, interpretation of languages is not an exact science.
That's sure. That's correct. As far as I can tell, and one of the people that helped me the most with this book is Michael McCafferty. He's a Native American linguist. He's not a Native American, but he's a linguist of Native American languages who has been reconstructing the once nearly extinct Miami, Illinois Indian language. The Miami and Illinois were once the same tribe. And what I find from him, from his writings, is we actually know a lot more specifics about the language than actually some people who were living at that time. My understanding, and matter of fact, he wrote, I can't remember what year it is, but it's in the Illinois Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society. He talks about that very thing. He has an article written there. And even people who lived at that time, who were learning the language, got things wrong. But they wrote it down, and it's been perpetuated. So according to my colleague, it might mean something more like to grease through. There's something to do with grease, fat, but the construction of the word onomastics, I guess you'd call it, seems a bit different than what Pierre Diliet, who wrote those words, wrote.
Other people came afterwards, Alloway, LaSalle. Did the 1673 expedition, was that the door opener?
Yes, exactly. In fact, the Jesuits wanted to find semi-sedentary tribes, farmers, because when they first came to Canada, They were dealing with woodland people who were constantly living in a seasonal subsistence pattern. But when they found the Wendat, or we would call the Huron, and the Illinois, these people are farmers. They live in large, large villages, and they supplement their diet with bison meat and deer meat and such. When they found the Illinois, since the Wendats were essentially destroyed by the Iroquois, now the Illinois groups are on the Jesuits' target. We need to get there. So Marquette was the first person to mention and document on a map these Illinois villages. And after Marquette died, then 2 years later, in 1677, Claude Jean Allouez came to take over Marquette's work. And we see that these villages keep getting larger, or the one at Kaskaskia up by Starved Rock. When Marquette was there in 1673, there was probably 1,480 people, give or take 200. When he returned 2 years later, there was about 6,000 people living there. And when Allouez was there in 1677, he counted 351 cabins or huts, which roughly 20 people per there. So you're over 7,000 people. And then when LaSalle pulled up on shore there on New Year's Day of 1680, his missionaries count 460. So this village is huge and getting bigger. And so for that reason there, the French were interested for trade, conversion, and things like that to get into that, to get to that village. But when LaSalle, who was here in 1680, based his entire, I believe, his entire success of his mission of what Joliet told to Claude de Blanc, who was the head Jesuit in Canada. Joliet lost Marquette's paperwork, lost his report in a canoe wreck. And so now he goes to meet with the head Jesuit to give him a verbal account of what he and Marquette had just did. And you can read that in Jesuit Relations, volume 58. And he made some pretty big claims. LaSalle had access to that. And LaSalle also had access to a map, a period map from that time. So LaSalle says, you know, I think I can do this. I can make it to the Gulf of Mexico. Because climate, we're in a time called the Little Ice Age. And so communication between Quebec and France was limited for, you know, several months a year. Ships can't come in. They're going to run into icebergs out in the shipping lanes and things like that. So we need a port that's 365 days a year ice-free, so we can communicate that way, and a easier place to bring trade goods rather than drag them up to Montreal. So LaSalle figured, after finding out what Joliet told de Blanc, that I think I can do this. And so he got royal permission to come down here. So LaSalle gets here, builds forts, more people are coming. LaSalle's gone, the trade increases. Now they move from Starved Rock in 1691 to Lake Peoria, so now the operation's moving here. And then in 1699, d'Iberville locates the mouth of the Mississippi River via the Gulf of Mexico. Now we have a huge corridor opening up, and they're infiltrating as we go along. But
so the French are in Quebec. Mm-hmm. They're in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. They want to make a connection between the two, and they've got fur trading is established. Mm-hmm. What happened between 1673 and 1754 when the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War began?
Well, a lot of things. One of the things was between about 1712 and about 1733, there was what are called the Fox Wars. And the Fox and the French did not get along. It's one of the times when the French, who normally got along, had great relations with most tribes, what they did was they just could not get along with the Fox, and the Fox had a very good complaint against the French, and the French literally tried to wipe them off the map. They tried to hunt down and kill every last Fox Indian that they could find. The Fox had to take refuge with the Sauk Indians, their cousins. So what that did is the French couldn't use any of the rivers up north. They couldn't go down the Wisconsin rivers. The Fox will get them. They couldn't go down the Rock River. The Fox will get them. Couldn't go down the Mississippi River or the Illinois River. very dangerous. So it drove them down to the Ohio River to use that so they can avoid the fox. So that's one thing that brought the ball of the French to that area of the country. That combined with a number of different things.
And then they had to cede land as a result of the French and Indian War in 1763.
That's correct.
And I'd like to continue the conversation.
Sure.
In fact, I will continue the conversation, just not on camera.
Sure.
Mark Wolzinski, thank you so much. He's the author of Joliet and Marquette, A New History of the 1673 Expedition. We appreciate you being here on At Issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll be back next time with another edition of At Issue. Please join us then.